You clicked on this because someone you love is gone, and somewhere in the back of your mind, there's a specific version of this question you haven't said out loud. Not just, are they okay? Something more precise. If the body was burned, if there was nothing left to bury, nothing left in the ground with a name on it, does that change anything? Does the part of them that mattered still go wherever it was supposed to go? You've probably already tried to answer this yourself, in the middle of the night, without meaning to. You've told yourself it doesn't matter, that a soul isn't made of the same material as ash, that the method of death or disposal couldn't possibly be the thing deciding an eternal outcome. But you've also felt the doubt underneath that reassurance, because nobody actually told you that. You assumed it. And an assumption isn't the same thing as an answer. There's a manuscript almost 2,500 years old that was built specifically to answer questions like that. Not with comfort, with structure. A described place, with divisions, with categories, with rules about what determines where a soul ends up. And by the end of this, you're going to know exactly what happens according to that structure when a body doesn't survive intact, and whether heaven, the way you've always pictured it, is even the right word for where it goes. I'm Daniel Voss. You're watching The Black Parchment. This channel reads the manuscripts they don't want on your shelf. Subscribe, because we're not doing a general tour of the afterlife today. We're answering one specific question, all the way through, and the answer is stranger than either yes or no. Let's go. Here's the assumption most people carry into this question without realizing it. That the method of death, how the body ended, what happened to the physical remains, is the thing the afterlife cares about. Burned versus buried, whole versus scattered. As if the condition of the corpse is the variable the system is tracking. The oldest surviving account of the Jewish afterlife, as a structured place, says something different. 1 Enoch chapter 22. Preserved most completely in the Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscript tradition housed in Ethiopia, with overlapping portions surviving in the Aramaic fragments recovered from Qumran Cave 4, catalogued as 4Q204, describes the patriarch Enoch being taken by the archangel Raphael to a mountain in the west. Not a metaphorical mountain, a specific one, hollow, containing 4 separate chambers where the dead are held before final judgment. Michael Knibb, whose 1978 Oxford Critical Edition of the Ge'ez text remains the standard scholarly reference for this material, treats chapter 22 as the earliest surviving Jewish attempt to give the afterlife an actual internal geography, walls, divisions, categories, rather than leaving it as an undifferentiated pit. And here's the detail that should immediately reframe the question you came here with. The 4 categories in that chamber system aren't sorted by what happened to the body. They're sorted by conduct and by circumstance of death. The first chamber holds the righteous. The second holds sinners whose wrongdoing was never punished during their lifetime, held in darkness while they wait. The third holds those who were killed unjustly, murdered, wronged, denied justice while alive. The fourth holds those the text describes as permanently separated, with no restoration anticipated for them at all. Have you ever needed to believe that the manner of someone's death, sudden, violent, undignified, anything but peaceful, couldn't possibly be held against them? That instinct is already answered in this text. The third chamber exists specifically for those who were killed unjustly, and the text describes their spirits as crying out, not in shame, but as an accusation waiting to be heard by the same authority that will hand down the final judgment. Notice what's absent from that list. 4 categories, each one defined by conduct, circumstance, or the treatment of injustice. Not one of them is defined by what became of the corpse. So if manner of death is already accounted for, and the sorting mechanism isn't physical outcome, that raises the actual question underneath the one you clicked on. Not, does cremation disqualify someone? Something closer to, does the system even have a category for it at all? The text doesn't leave the 4-chamber structure unexplained. Enoch asks Raphael directly why the dead are divided this way, and Raphael answers with the actual design principle behind the entire system. The divisions exist so that each soul receives treatment that matches how it lived and how it was treated in life. Not treatment that matches how it died physically, treatment that matches conduct and justice. That answer is the whole mechanism, stated outright, inside the text itself. It isn't inference, it isn't a reading between the lines. Raphael names the principle directly, And everything that follows in this investigation is that principle followed to its conclusion. Here's the finding, and it's a more useful one than a fabricated verse would be. Cremation, as a practice, was not part of the world Enoch was written in. Archaeological surveys of Second Temple period burial sites across the southern Levant, the same region and centuries this text was composed and copied in, consistently show near total absence of cremation among Jewish communities of that era. Burial, not burning, was the standard, practiced with striking consistency across hundreds of documented sites. The text doesn't name the cremated as a category the way it names the righteous, the unpunished sinner, or the unjustly killed. For one reason, it didn't need to. That absence is the answer. It means the four chambers were never sorted by the condition of the remains in the first place. Conduct and manner of death are the only variables the system tracks, and once you see that, the entire premise most people bring to this question collapses. The fear that a burned body might somehow be locked out of justice was never a fear this system had room for. Sit with that for a second. You didn't need a verse about ashes. You needed to see what the sorting mechanism actually was, and now you have. But that raises the next problem immediately. Because Jewish and later Christian resurrection hope, the thing Enoch's later chapters are building toward, is described as bodily. A body restored, standing again. Which means we still have to ask what happens when there's no body left to raise. This is where the text stops being about sorting and starts being about promise. The righteous chamber, according to chapter 22, isn't a final resting place. It's a holding position. Souls waiting for a final judgment that hasn't happened yet, when the imbalance between how a life actually went and how it should have gone gets corrected. Compare that to the language the text uses elsewhere for the fourth chamber, the one holding those it describes as having no hope of restoration at all. That contrast is deliberate. Some wait for something, others wait for nothing. Do you know the difference between grief that has an ending point somewhere in it and grief that doesn't? Between missing someone and trusting there's still a reunion ahead versus missing someone with no framework for what comes next? Enoch built an entire chamber system around exactly that distinction, and it built it 2,000 years before either of those feelings had a name attached to them. Now here's the load-bearing question your original one was really asking. If the promised outcome, vindication, inheritance, the eternal kingdom described later in chapters 45, 51, 58, and 62, depends on bodily resurrection, what happens to a body that no longer exists to be raised? Here's the answer the text supports. James Vanderkam, whose full translation of Enoch remains one of the standard English editions, George Nicholsburg, whose Hermenia commentary is the most detailed academic treatment of this text in English, and Michael Knibb, working from the same Ge'ez manuscript tradition, all describe the same underlying premise running through the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 105. The reversal promised there is never described as a natural process the body performs on its own. It's described as an act done to the righteous, from outside, by the same authority that assigned them to the chamber in the first place. That settles it. Resurrection in this text was never framed as biological continuity, as needing a fixed quantity of physical material to reassemble. It's framed as an act of authority over whatever remains, however little that is. A system built that way doesn't have a gap where ashes could fall through. It was never depending on the body staying intact to begin with. Think about what that actually removes from the equation. Fire, decay, scattering, loss. Every physical fear people carry about what happens to a body after death. None of it touches a system where the outcome was never about physical continuity in the first place. The authority doing the restoring was never described as limited by what survives. It was described as the same authority that assigned the chamber, ran the waiting period, and issued the judgment. Nothing in that chain requires an intact body. Every link in it requires only conduct, and justice, and the authority to act on both. Now for the second half of the promise this video made you. Because vindication and inheritance are one thing, but you clicked on a title that asked which heaven. The four chambers hold the dead before judgment. The destination itself comes after. Once judgment arrives, Enoch names the destination directly across chapters 45, 51, 58, and 62. Chapter 45 promises the righteous a transformed earth and heaven, a permanent dwelling with what the text calls the elect one. Chapter 51 describes the earth itself giving back what it holds, the righteous raised and restored to walk in that kingdom. Chapters 58 and 62 describe the outcome in the language of light, the righteous shining, standing in the presence of God's throne, in blessing and peace, in direct and explicit contrast to the shame and destruction reserved for the wicked in the same passages. That's the heaven the title is asking about. Not a waiting room, but the final destination the waiting room exists to lead to. And 1 Enoch is specific about what that kingdom is not. It isn't tiered, it isn't numbered. Later tradition, a separate, later text called 2 Enoch, composed centuries after this material, introduces a system of